among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So as you can see here, this is a very clear description of what we read in the Gospels. And of course, and this was written by a non-Christian Jew who was a contemporary. In fact, within 150 years of Jesus' life, we have 10 non-Christian sources that mention him. So outside of the New Testament, we have 10 non-Christian sources that mention him. And some of these sources are not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian. They're opposed to Christianity. And yet they mention Jesus or his life and ministry. And just by way of comparison, we have just 9 mentioning Tiberius Caesar, who was the Roman emperor during the time of Jesus. So here we have this middle-of-nowhere carpenter who's mentioned 10 times, and the ruler at the time is only mentioned 9. So we do have non-Christian references to Jesus. And as you see on the handout, if you look at what we can know about Jesus, just not even opening up the New Testament, is that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. So that's what we get from non-Christian sources. Historians, Christian, non-Christian, there's practically no one who doubts the existence of Jesus. That he was an actual historical figure is pretty much beyond doubt, but if you need evidence for it, there it is. Question number 2 is, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? Now, first, we need to remember that the New Testament is not a source. It's not one source, but contains 27 different documents written by 9 different authors over a period of 50 years. So that's at least counted as 9 sources there, if you count different authors. So again, New Testament is not just one source, but it's at least 9 sources. And there's a few things about it. Number 1, we have nearly, this is letter A, I think, in your outline, is the number of manuscripts we have. We have nearly 5,800 handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. 5,800 manuscripts or partial manuscripts. In addition, there are roughly 20,000 manuscripts in other languages such as Latin, Syriac, Coptic, or Arabic. So we have a huge amount of manuscripts. The closest comparison that we have is Homer's Iliad, which has only 1,800 manuscripts that it's based on. And in fact, most of the rest of the ancient works that we have are less than a dozen. And these are unquestioned works. So we have 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament. Again, the closest is 1,800. And then the rest are distant thirds. So number 1 is the number of copies that we have. Under B, the time gap between the originals and the first surviving copy. So we don't have any original copies. In fact, we don't have any original copies of any ancient document. But what we have is copies of copies, right? And now for the New Testament, the copies that we have the parts that we have are within 25 years of the original writing, and that's John's Gospel. We have parts of John's Gospel that are within 25 years of when he wrote it, which is incredibly close. Again, Homer, Iliad, is the closest comparison, and it's over 400 years from when he wrote. The earliest copy is 400 years from when Homer's Iliad is written. So the Gospels, the time gap between some of the earliest manuscripts we have and when they were written is incredibly small. Letter C, supported evidence. In addition to these manuscripts, we have the writings of the early church fathers. That's in the 2nd and 3rd century. Again, these are the guys who were right after the apostles, who lived right next to Peter and Paul and them. And in their writings, the New Testament is quoted over 36,000 times. That's the church fathers that are right next to the apostles. And if you read all the church fathers for a few centuries after, there are over 1 million citations of the New Testament. Over 1 million citations of the New Testament by the church fathers. So in other words, without a single New Testament manuscript, we could still reconstruct pretty much the entire New Testament. In fact, it was in 303, I forget the ruler's name, he actually ordered an edict that all the Christian literature would be destroyed, and much of it was. But there was so much of it out there. In fact, sometimes you think if there was just one copy preserved that would be better, but the fact that there was so many copies so quickly ensured the accuracy of it, because even though there were errors, you could compare it with other ones, right? So that you knew no one could, if there were mistakes made, you could check it with other ones. There were so many copies to compare it with. But yeah, we can almost construct the entire New Testament from just the church fathers and their quotations, which is amazing when you think about it. D, reconstruction. So how do they put together these manuscripts, and how do they determine what's in there? Now, some have estimated that there are about 200,000 errors in the New Testament manuscripts. 200,000. Now, first of all, these aren't errors per se, but they're variant readings. In other words, there's different readings. The vast majority of them are grammatical, so you might have a different spelling, or punctuation might be different. Probably the one that we're the least certain about is from John 15:11, where Jesus says that your joy may be complete, or my joy may be complete. We're not sure whether it's your joy or my joy, but again, that's the biggest theological issue on these errors. I mean, to me, it doesn't really make much difference. Either way, there's no theological aspect that hangs on that. Furthermore, with these errors that they call, if there's a single variant, that's in 2,000 of the manuscripts, they count it as 2,000 errors. So you get these scribes that are copying out the Bible, right? And let's say one guy makes a spelling mistake. So what that means is every manuscript that's copied from that is going to have that same manuscript. Now that, I think, is one error, but if there's 2,000 manuscripts that come from that, they're counting that as 2,000 errors. Well, it's really one error repeated 2,000 times. So when you hear about all these errors, you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt. Now, if you look on your outline, I gave a hypothetical example of how a passage is reconstructed. Again, this is hypothetical, but if you look at these 4 examples, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see that there's an error in every single one of them. How many of you think that you have difficulty figuring out what the original said? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's pretty obvious. And that's, again, because of the multitude of manuscripts that we can compare, that we can say beyond a doubt, we know what this would say, right? So that's, again, an example of these errors and how they work. The New Testament scholar and Princeton professor Bruce Metzger estimated that the Mahabharata of Hinduism is copied with about 90% accuracy. Homer's Iliad with about 95% accuracy. By comparison, he estimated that the Bible is about 99.5% accurate. Moreover, the 0.5% doesn't affect a single doctrine of the Christian faith. As that example I gave earlier, that's as far as it goes. So all this adds up to the fact that what we have in the New Testament is what was written 2,000 years ago, which is, I think, amazing. Like what they wrote is what we have. The pen of John and Peter and Paul. Number 3, is the New Testament reliable? So we know that we have what they wrote, but is it reliable? Well, under A, we have early testimony. Early testimony. We know that the New Testament was written by 100 AD. Absolutely know it was written by 100 AD, which is 70 years after the death of Jesus. How? Well, 25 of the 27 books are quoted by the church fathers, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, who wrote between 95 and 110 AD. The only ones that weren't quoted were Jude and 2 John. Well, we can assume 2 John because they had 3 John, so 2 John comes first. And Jude, I mean, we can give them that, but I think we have pretty good evidence that Jude was there. But we have really good reason to believe that they were all written, or almost all written, by 70 AD, just 40 years after Jesus' death. Now, why is this? What happened in 70 AD of significance? It's very key. 70 AD. Right. The temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. And we can be almost certain, well, first of all, since Jesus predicted it, that the New Testament writers would have mentioned something about it. And we see no mention of the temple being destroyed. So we have pretty good evidence that the New Testament was written by 70 AD. Some people question Revelation, whether when John wrote that, it might have been a little bit later, as well as his gospel. But that brings us to it being written back into the 40s and 50s AD. That's just 15 years from the death of Jesus that some of the first books were starting to be written. And much of this construction, it's done from dates that we know. So we know when Acts was written, for example. Well, because we know when Acts was written, we know Luke was before that, right? So Luke had to be written first. Well, Luke borrows from Mark, so we know Mark had to, so it's kind of a domino effect with some of these. When you know a date, and you know something had to come prior to that date, you obviously know it's earlier. So that's one of the ways we trace back some of these dates, and we know that they are very, very early. In fact, there's a creed in 1 Corinthians 15, I think, that Paul writes that some scholars think goes back to within months of Jesus' death. For sure within the first couple of years, but they think that this creed is that early, within months of Jesus' death, and it finds its way into Corinthians. Number 4, eyewitness testimony about Jesus. Number 4 is eyewitness testimony about Jesus. So under A, this is varied and numerous. In other words, it was different people and many people at a time, too. So Matthew, Mark, and John, in their Gospels, all claim to be witnesses of Jesus' death and resurrection. Luke wasn't an eyewitness himself, but records the most eyewitness accounts in the New Testament between Luke and Acts. And Luke is considered to be an exemplary historian by Christian and non-Christian scholars alike. In fact, there are skeptics who went to Acts I can't remember if Ben mentioned this in his Acts series, but there are skeptics who went to Acts and were kind of skeptical. But after looking at, I think someone recorded 86 events in Acts that are historically documented. Luke was an amazing historian. Let's look at a couple passages. First one is Acts 2:32. Acts chapter 2:32. This is Peter talking. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Here Peter's claiming to be a witness. Acts 3:15, just a little further along. Acts 3:15. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. And in Acts 4:18-20, one of my favorite passages in the Bible. I have many, but this is one of them. So they, that's the rulers, elders, and teachers of the law, so they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. Paul, of course, this is Peter, and John's with him, very clearly stating that. Paul, of course, had his own Damascus Road appearance, but also records Jesus appearing to all the apostles, to James, the brother of Jesus, who you remember, James wasn't a believer until after the resurrection. In fact, there's a story in the gospel that kind of hints at his brothers trying to get him killed. We can't say that for sure, but they say, hey, why don't you go up to Jerusalem when they know that he wants to be killed? So we don't know if they were really being sneaky about that or what. But anyway, James was not a believer until after the resurrection. And then Paul goes on to say even more than 500 people at once. And this is all recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, which, by the way, he says most of whom are alive today when he wrote that. So people could go check with them. So A is varied and numerous for eyewitness testimony about Jesus. B, truthfulness of the witnesses. Are the New Testament writers telling the truth? And here we're going to get into a few of the details, because this is where a lot of people will push back, right? Well, they had an agenda. How do we know they were telling the truth? Number one, embarrassing details. This is the principle that if someone is making up a story, they are probably not going to make up something that makes them look bad. How many of you have ever lied to make yourself look good? Okay. Those of you without your hands up are lying to make yourself look good. How many of you lied to make yourself look bad? We just don't do that, right? How are the disciples portrayed in the Gospels? They're presented as dim-witted, uncaring, rebuked, doubting cowards. Are they going to write that about themselves and make it up? Let's look at A, dim-witted. We won't go through it all, but you have the references there. Mark 9, Luke 18, John 12. You can look that up later. Uncaring. Twice they fall asleep on Jesus when he asks for their prayers. Remember, this is, probably Jesus' greatest need of having friends around him, asking them to pray for him, and they fall asleep. C, they were rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus in Mark. Can you imagine the disciples sitting around and Mark kind of goes, hey, Pete, I'm going to spice the story up a bit. I'm going to have Jesus call you Satan. What's Peter going to say? You have him call you Satan. I don't want to be called Satan. But there it is in the Bible, right? And D, they're cowards. All the disciples but one run and hide when he's arrested and crucified. And Peter, who does follow at a distance, denies him 3 times. And by the way, who are the first ones to go to the tomb? It's the women. The men are all hiding for fear of the Jews. The women are the ones going to the tomb. And E, they are doubters. They are doubters. Even after Jesus told them and taught them that he would rise from the dead, they still didn't believe. And this is actually the most amazing. It's almost amazing that this verse is in the Bible. If you look at Matthew 28:17, this is after Jesus was risen and he appears to them. Matthew 28:17 says, and when they saw him, they are the disciples, his followers. We don't know how many, but when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. He's standing in front of them, and some are doubting. And this is in our New Testament. Folks, these writers aren't making this up. They're not going to write these things about themselves. Number 2, embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. A, Jesus is considered out of his mind by his mom and brothers in Mark 3. B, he's not believed by his own brothers, John 7. They don't believe him. He's thought to be a deceiver in John 7:12. He's thought to be a deceiver. He's deserted by many of his followers. We see that in John 6. He's deserted. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed in Mark 3, and he's called a madman in John 10. This is the Messiah that these guys are writing about. And they're going to create a drunken, demon-possessed madman as their Messiah. It just doesn't make sense. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, something that could potentially be perceived as a sexual advance. Again, this would not be included if these guys were making it up. Jesus is crucified on a cross, despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. We read that in Deuteronomy 21 and Galatians 3. They would not have made up a Jewish Messiah. Well, first of all, they wouldn't have made him up crucified, but they wouldn't have had him crucified on a tree. And in difficult sayings of Jesus, Jesus declares that the Father is greater than I. They believe Jesus to be God. This gets to be a confusing saying. Why would they put that in there? Jesus says the Father is greater than I. Or in Matthew 24, he says he doesn't know the time of his second coming. In Matthew 21, Jesus curses a fig tree for not having figs in fig season, which seems to be a crazy thing to make up. Why would you have Jesus cursing a fig tree for not having figs when it's not even fig season? And finally, in Mark 6, Jesus seems unable to do miracles in his hometown. So we have all these incidents about Jesus that just would not be made up if the New Testament authors were making a story up. Number 3, demanding sayings of Jesus. We have many demanding sayings of Jesus regarding adultery, divorce, nonviolence, love and prayer for enemies, expectation of perfection, call to give up earthly comforts. I think you guys have all the references there. I think I included them in there. Adultery. Jesus says if you look at someone with lust, you're committing adultery. Pretty high standard that Jesus is setting. We talked about divorce before. Nonviolence. Jesus says, if someone takes your cloak, give them your shirt too. If they slap you on the right cheek, turn to them the left. Prayer for enemies, and so on. Demanding sayings of Jesus. Number 4, New Testament writers distinguished Jesus' words from their own. So the New Testament writers distinguished Jesus' words from their own. Why is this important? Well, we can see in the New Testament that there were a number of theological disputes, whether it was over circumcision or dietary laws or women in the church speaking in tongues. And if they were making it up, they could have just simply wrote in what they wanted to have happen. Similar to what happened in Mormonism, I think, where you could just write in what you want. But they didn't do that because these were the very words of Jesus that they were recording, and they distinguished them from their own. Number 5 is resurrection events. Resurrection events. Under A, the burial of Jesus in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, who, by the way, part of the people who condemned and crucified Jesus. Why would they include that? Furthermore, they could have talked to him to go confirm the resurrection or not. It could have been easily disproved. And yet we see that Jesus was buried in one of the Sanhedrin's own tombs. Number B under that, the first witnesses, the women. All 4 Gospels include women as the first to have witnessed Jesus' resurrection. Why would this have not been made up? A woman's testimony in the first century didn't count. Certainly much lower than a man's. And yet all 4 of the Gospels record the women there first. Now, I want you guys to think about it. How would that scene have been written if it was made up? The men would have marched in there like Chuck Norris, overpowered the guards, right? Triumphantly met Jesus, been praised by him, and then would go back and comfort the trembling women. Right? We know that's how it would be written, right? I can see the nods. If men were, they weren't making this up. The women were the first to discover Jesus. Letter C. This is actually interesting. The explanation of the Jews for the empty tomb. I don't know if I included this verse in there. I included the reference, Matthew 28, 11 to 15. This is in the Bible. I'm going to read this quickly. While they were going, behold, some of the guards went to the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a significant sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell the people his disciples came at night and stole him away while they were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. By the way, that story went a long time. It went well into the 1st, 2nd century. What's the interesting thing about this? The Jews are admitting there's no body. If there was a body, they would have produced it. Right there, they're admitting there is no body. So that's resurrection events. Number 6, historically confirmed people in the New Testament. There's over 30 historically confirmed people that we read about in the New Testament. These include Pilate, Caiaphas, Felix, and the entire Herodian bloodline. Now, if these guys were making stories up, and these are powerful people, someone would have exposed them for making stories up about these people that weren't true. So we do have over 30 historically confirmed people. Number 7, lack of perfect harmonization of the Gospels. A lack of perfect harmonization of the Gospels. That means that the writers included divergent or different details. They included different details. Now, how does this authenticate the Gospels? You're thinking that might be against it, but let me ask you, if you're a teacher of a class and you hand out a test paper and you get 30 of them back and 4 of them are identical, what are you going to think? They copied. They got together. But that's not what happened in the Gospels, right? In fact, it's interesting because the critics can't make their mind up on this. At one side of their mouth, they're saying, these Gospels are too harmonized. They're too similar. They must have been copied. And then the next minute, they'll say, well, look at all these different details. But actually, it's a perfect blend. And anyone who looks at eyewitness testimony or even news stories, you go look at a news story from 3 different news organizations, you're going to have the main events there, but the details are going to be different. So we have the Gospels, I think, as a perfect blend of harmonization, but different details, as you would expect from different eyewitnesses. Agreement on the major points and divergent on the details. Letter 8. the challenge to check out verifiable facts, including miracles, by the way. They were challenged. Luke, in Peter, in Acts, in 1 Corinthians. These writers all say, go check it out. Those 500 Paul mentioned were mostly alive. If they were making this up, there were people who could have said, sorry, that's not true. Number 9, the resurrection is described matter-of-factly, without embellishment. We talked a week or two ago about these apocryphal gospels that were not true gospels. One of them is the Gospel of Peter. And if you look at in the Gospel of Peter, which is not one of the gospels in the Bible, it's a forgery. But you look at the resurrection account in there, and it has more of what I described with the disciples if a man had written it, where the disciples are almost the heroes when they discover Jesus. They overwhelm the guards. There's this floating cross above Jesus when he moves and everything. When the gospel writers, they didn't include that. It was almost matter of fact. When they talk about miracles, they're amazing. And when they talk about the resurrection, it's just a matter of fact how they do it. And finally, lastly, number 10, and I think this is one of my favorites, and one of the most authenticating for me, the disciples' radical behavior following the resurrection. Number 10, the disciples' radical behavior following the resurrection. Those include 1, or I guess letter A on your outline. Animal sacrifice system is forever replaced by Jesus' perfect sacrifice. Immediately, right? The animal sacrifice system ends for Christians. B, abandoning parts of the law of Moses, such as circumcision or associating with Gentiles or dietary laws. Some of the laws of Moses are now seen as obsolete almost immediately. C, strict monotheism, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Strict monotheism gives way to worship as Jesus as the God-man. And we see the beginnings of the Trinity talked about early on, right? So the Jews, even though when we do talk about the Trinity, there are indications in the Old Testament. There's this belief called the two powers we'll get into. But there's no way that they would have thought a man would be God. But obviously the disciples believed that immediately upon his resurrection. D, the observance of the Sabbath switches to Sunday as a new day of worship. Remember for breaking the Sabbath, severe penalties, right? And yet, almost immediately, they go to a Sunday worship. And finally, and probably the most compelling, the disciples' willingness to undergo persecution, torture, and death rather than deny the resurrection of Jesus. J. Warner Wallace talks about, he was a cold case homicide detective, and he talks about the 3 motivators that are behind all of the crimes he's looked at, either sex, money, or power. Did the disciples get any of that? Did the disciples get girls? Did they get rich? They got poor. Did they get power? No. If anything, they got the opposite of that. They already thought they were God's chosen people. Why would they invent a religion? And just by comparison, some will say, well, Muslims will die too. They do kind of, they sacrifice themselves. But here's the difference. Muslims will kill themselves for something they to believe is true. They believe what they're dying for is true. If you're saying the disciples did that, they're dying, all of them, for something they knew to be a lie. That's way different. Maybe 1 crazy or 2 crazy guys would do, but not all these disciples and early Christians. They would not die for something they knew was a lie. All right, I went a little bit of overtime, but we started a little bit late. Is there any burning question that someone has or comment? All right.